Hello, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Andrew Lee to this Ask an Expert for the Ministry of Eco Education. Hello, Andrew.
Hello, glad to be here.
Superb. You are an amazing character, and I've only just met you in person, and I am so pleased to be able to talk to you today. You're a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. You hold an honorary lectureship and associate fellowship at the UCL's Centre for Climate Change and Sustainability Education. You're head of operations at the Oxford Climate Alumni Network, and provide not only are you still in schools in working in schools, but you provide consultancy in climate emergency education. You are an incredible person to be talking to today. So, and one of the areas that I really want to focus on is these pitfalls in climate education. But let's start. You've been teaching young people about climate for many years. I've just read out a long list of things that you're doing now, but how did you get here? How
Well,
did you get
look,
to this point?
at the end of the day, I'm a geography teacher, and I read geography at the University of Sydney. I was lucky enough to go and read geography at Oxford with David Harvey, and so I've been in the classroom. And of course, because you've been focusing on geography for so long, you can't avoid issues to do with climate change, climate crisis, and so on. And as that became more and more evident, it just grew and grew and grew in my education practice within the field of geography teaching. And then, towards the end of the time I was in the classroom, I was running climate symposia and talks and programs and so on because I was so invested in it. And then I decided I'd leave the classroom and now working in an academic sphere, although still in the classroom a little bit, doing as much as I can to address the climate crisis.
Yeah, and that's not dissimilar in a way to my journey. Taught for many, many years in schools, and now have left to really focus on what I find is particularly important. The climate crisis is here and now. So how have you noticed? Obviously, as there is more in the news, even if it's not covered in depth. How has the conversation in classrooms shifted over the time you've been working in climate education? Are young people, do you feel, really better informed now, or is there still a level of confusion?
Look, I think the unfolding has been slow and uneven, and sometimes it depends upon whether there's someone in the school that is particularly passionate about it. Hopefully in the schools that I've taught in, I've carried that, I've waved that flag, but then another school may not have that, and so I think it continues to be uneven. I think the curricula has unfolded evenly. It's moving in the right direction, but slowly. And so I think young people are, in many respects, generally better educated, but it's very patchy. Their level of enthusiasm waxes and wanes, and that I think depends somewhat upon the messages and the people who are messaging them about the climate crisis.
Yeah, I'd say similar. Some schools I go into and they're on it like a bonnet, and other schools it's just like, yeah, climate crisis. Well, we talk about recycling.
Yeah.
Um, so no, I agree, and I think I'd like to see more leadership from the top personally to say this is the way forward, and hopefully the new curriculum, which comes out in a couple of years, will definitely open up,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and give educators more time to really have these discussions in school, because it's not just causes and consequences; it's about how we feel, how we act, what justice looks like. Um, so alongside curricular design and consultancy, I believe you lead climate fresk workshops. And or have done. And I know that they can be outstanding, but what does good climate education look like to you?
Well, look, in a sense, we've got two aspects of that. We've got climate education for teachers, and we've got climate education for young people. I think, because I'm in the field of climate change education, one of the things I'm obviously looking at both of them, but one of the key issues is lifting up the level of knowledge and expertise amongst teaching staff, and I know that that's problematic in many ways, for all sorts of reasons, costing, time, etc., etc. I think the Climate Fresh program one of many different approaches, whether it be the climate ambassadors program and so on as well, is a very good way to lift the general knowledge of climate change information, and it's marketed as a sort of game. It's a collaborative experience, and I think it's one of the things that's very good for teachers, particularly. It runs over a 2.5 to 3 hours, but it's good because it also corrects misconceptions, of which there are many in the climate sphere. And one of the issues that will come up with in the context of this conversation is that often teachers who are not geographers and they're not trained in climate feel insecure or lack confidence. And I think we've got to find strategies for improving their level of knowledge, but keep in mind the constraints that we have and teachers have, in terms of cost of time and money and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think that it has to start with teacher training and making sure that teachers feel confident. Because the last stat I saw was from a few years ago. It was 70% of teachers don't feel confident about teaching the climate crisis. So obviously we need to support them. It'd be nice to see that rolled out on a wider basis.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is that there is a lack of confidence, but teachers need to know that they don't need to know everything about everything, and all of us who've been experienced in the classroom know that sometimes we have no idea, and that doesn't mean that we do nothing. And it's quite possible to go in the classroom and learn together, but the teacher does at the same time need to make sure that they're spreading information and not misinformation.
Yeah, absolutely. So leading on to that perfectly. Can you describe? So I came to a talk with you at the Geographical Association conference a few weeks ago. Can you describe the common pitfalls educators might experience when they teach climate change? And I know you did a whole hour-long presentation on this, so just a short summary of the pitfalls, please.
Yeah, look, some of the things we've already discussed, the lack of knowledge and confidence. And as I said, teachers don't need to feel as if they need to know everything about everything. And it is, we know, being immersed in the climate crisis space, that it is a complex and wicked problem. And so, having a crystal clear understanding of all aspects of climate change is an insurmountable task. But you don't need to conquer that insurmountable task in order to move forward with climate education. So, I think one of the things that schools need to do is to integrate professional development of climate into their standard CPD programs, rather than thinking, well, we haven't got any money to send you to this or time to do that and so on. So, well, you're going to be there for a pupil-free day because we've got to do some CPD, and that has to be climate, or climate has to be incorporated in that. And so I think that's a key thing, and many of these things are about burrowing into things that already exist, rather than putting more on the table, and changing focus a little bit. The other thing is a lack of good resources, and not just. I mean, there's actually quite a lot of resources available, but being able to differentiate the good ones from the bad ones people need a little bit of hand with. I know that there are various organisations, the Royal Meteorological Society, for example, are giving some sort of classification for content, which is great, which is exactly what's needed. And teachers, I suppose, part of the CPT dimension I mentioned before is that teachers with more experience will be able to differentiate between good and weaker resources.
And actually, just before we started recording, you held up a book that was by the GA, wasn't it? The teaching.
So I mean, there are a few things. I mean, I just got a copy of this.
What did you say? 56 pages? Thinking critically in
56
geography.
pages. It's very light, but it's actually really well put together. I mean, I must confess I haven't read through the whole thing. I read through the first half of it, and I was very impressed with it because it's very succinct, and goes through the issues. Part of it to do with basic climate change knowledge, but then looking at other aspects and resources and strategies and so on. So that's certainly a good starting point. The Centre for Climate Change and Sustainability Education, of which I am a honorary lecturer at UCL, has a website which looks at different strategies for teaching climate change through a whole range of different subject areas, and that's a great place to go to as well. Um, there's also a toolkit which I developed with Professor Nicola Walsh, which looks the, at a tertiary level, but still useful in schools, to look at the way that climate crisis content can be incorporated in subjects that you wouldn't have thought would necessarily cover or contain climate content. So that's useful as well. I think we can put that in a link in a minute.
Yeah.
I can finish. The other issue is to do with the overcrowded curriculum, this idea, well, how are we going to fit that in? Well, once again, as I said a moment ago, it's like burrowing things inside. If you're going to teach maths and you're teaching about Sally and John earning enough money to buy some marbles, then, why could you not be using climate numbers there so that it's more relevant and contemporary and compelling? So that's the kind of thing, if you're doing English, why not explore some novels relating to climate anxiety or climate crisis? And if you're working in music, if we're going to choose some songs to listen to, why don't we listen to or analyze? Why don't we listen to some songs that relate to environment, of which there's no shortage? So it's a matter of
Neil Young's Mother Nature on the Run in the 1970s just sprang into my mind.
no, exactly.
It's, we've known about some of these serious issues for so many years that,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
now it does feel like there's a turning point and that there is more of these conversations. And it's partly because we're getting closer towards crisis point, but, the more we can put in, the better.
Yeah, yeah, no, and there are lots of lists of those sorts of things. Cutting all the trees down and putting in the tree museum, and et cetera, et cetera.
And
The
scaffolding for younger kids doing the Lorax and older kids,
Exactly,
doing,
exactly.
um,
And then the next thing is a lack of buy-in across the school. We need to get senior leaders championing and celebrating the climate crisis content. I was lucky in the last school I was teaching at, the head was very supportive, and the school I'm working with on the Isle of Wight equally so. And actually there being some impetus for interdisciplinarity. And I've been working on a concept called Powerful Resources, which encourages interdisciplinarity in schools by putting a very public resource in the school, whether it be a sculpture. At Ride School, I've just installed a table and chairs that are painted with thermochromic paint, so that if you put your hand on it, you can see your handprint, with a view to children sitting on it and discussing, heat and energy and what's going on. So it's that kind of thing. And then once you put something like that in the school, you ask the maths department, well, how would the maths department respond to that? You ask the English department, how might the English department respond to that? You ask PE, and so on. How does everyone respond to it? And then at the end of the term, you may have a plenary session in an assembly and say, well, let's ask maths, let's ask English, let's ask French, let's ask so on. So
That's beautifully creative. Just a table and chairs, a slightly unusual table and chairs to be fair, but
yeah,
and see what those climate conversations precipitate out from it.
exactly. And then the other thing is, sometimes there's a fear of a political dimension. We know that the climate crisis shouldn't be, but is often political, and so schools often are a little concerned about that. Once again, the school takes a leadership. We're presenting IPCC facts. We're not. It's not a political decision. We're just teaching the truth. And if you're going to teach this to children, they decide, how they're going to respond to it. We're not teaching them to go out and demonstrate. We're teaching them to be aware of what they're doing,
Yeah.
and what's happening. Yeah, so in a nutshell, it's those five areas, I think, that are some of the things that get in the way, but there are ways forward, as I've discussed. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. And as I say, I just think you're, incredibly creative, and that's the joy I find in climate education is that actually there's so many ways in. Whether I'm doing a workshop tomorrow about soils and biochar, and about we can use soils to store carbon, and so it's just you find your own area that you're enthusiastic about and make those links into climate. So one of the things I've really come across, started thinking about deeply recently, is I'm a science teacher, and a PhD scientist, and I think that and being at the Geographical Association conference made me really realise how good critical thinking is in geography. And I think in some ways we're missing that in science in the curriculum. There's just not enough time. You can't have those deep inquiry questions about the consequences, but not just to Earth maybe, but just to ourselves and to the non-human dimensions of Earth. So knowledge and critical thinking are foundations to good climate education, I feel. Um, do you find that climate education sometimes slides into sort of advocacy rather than that inquiry, though?
Look. I think it's mission critical that we encourage children to think deeply about the information that they get relating to the climate crisis, because information comes from all sorts of different channels, and some of them are information, some of them are misinformation, some of them are disinformation, and so we have to encourage children to think critically. And I've just done a project with the Royal Meteorological Society, and which is going to be released shortly, designed for teachers over a couple of lessons to go through to help young people think critically. As I said before, the idea really is to get children to think carefully and have good information at their disposal. And our job isn't to tell them what to do; it's to make them aware of what they're doing, and that's critical. We're educators, so we educate. Our job isn't really to tell them to take the day off and go and march. But one hopes that when they're aware of the circumstances, they're in a position to discuss things intelligently, and sometimes there may even be pushback in the domestic context when an aunt or an uncle or might be a climate denier, and that information's come through to them from a trusted source, and yet we've got to be able to equip them to respond to that and to say, well, there are other points of view here.
Um, and I think that encouraging advocacy, as you say, not the protest, but the maybe writing to your MP, maybe trying to have hold an assembly to raise awareness across the school or in the local community. I think that could be really beneficial, and especially people listen to youth voice. I think sometimes when you know.
Uh,
I think in my 50s, I'm not sure people listen to me in the same way as they listen to young people. So
yeah,
let's encourage
Look,
them.
I think that's absolutely true. One of the things I was talking before about powerful resources, and a powerful resource I used in another school was a slice of tree, and children could count the rings. They could look at good years and bad years, and think about what's happening to forests and so on. And one of the exercises was to get young people to write to their MP as a English writing exercise. And in the work that I've been doing on the Isle of Wight, I've actually got young people to write to the local MP, who's been really quite helpful. Some years ago, I did a research project. I interviewed 600 children by questionnaire, and I came up with various conclusions. But one of them was that many of them were completely disenchanted with conventional politics, and I think that's something we've got to address, because whether we like it or not, we live in a political world, and that's how decisions are made, and so we have to find ways to re-engage young people with politics, and actually, dare I say it, put politicians on the spot if we have to respond to young people. I mean, at the end of the day, they're going to be voting for them or not voting for them very shortly anyway. So it's a vested interest.
Indeed, and leading on from that, when I heard you at the GA conference, you talked about constructive optimism. I don't think you use the term hope very often with young people, but this term constructive optimism, I came away with, and I absolutely agree. What's the difference between constructive optimism and hope, except for the fact they're spelt differently?
It's very interesting, and I suppose there are a lot of terms that we easily roll out a little bit uncritically. And I was visiting a professor at Deakin University in Australia recently, and she was talking to me about the relationship between the terms hope and constructive optimism, and I reflected upon it, and I felt that actually she was quite right. Hope in a sense, always floating around hope is the capacity for failure or the possibility of failure, and it also disengages people from what's going on. It's like, oh, we just hope things will sort them out. To what extent does that engage us? And so constructive optimism is more a kind of platform, is that we have some problems, we have some solutions, but the solutions are not going to solve themselves. We've got to work on them, and so we have a situation where we have to put our shoulder to the wheel, and we can do this. And I think that that's a much better way of framing things. And I think one of the things that comes across in terms of teacher education too is the way we frame things. And all good teachers know that you can frame things and cut information in different ways, and the framing of this is very, very important. We have a problem. We're finding solutions, but it's a job that's not done yet. We all have a responsibility to put our shoulders to the wheel in whichever discipline we're working in whichever field we're in, whichever institution we're working in. The class, a teacher has a responsibility to do this. The school has a responsibility. The government has a responsibility. We all have a responsibility, and it is shoulder to the wheel.
Yeah, no, we are in a climate crisis and biodiversity crisis, and everything we can do is a bonus. As Catherine Hayhoe says, every fraction of a degree matters, and if we
Yeah,
got the whole education system across the UK making a difference, then that's only a positive thing. That constructive optimism I love.
yeah.
So just to finish up, if a teacher or curriculum designer takes one thing away from this conversation, what would you want it to be?
Look, I think it needs to filter through everyday practice, and it needs to filter through our own lives, and from a teacher's point of view, it has to filter into the classroom. And if a consistent message is being given, maybe from a different disciplinary angle, but a consistent message is being given from the people that young people are coming into contact with every day, their teachers, who should be aspirational, or that young people should look up to or respect, then I think we're in a much better shape than otherwise we might be.
Indeed. You seem to get a real buzz off the work you do, and it's a joy to listen to you, I have to say. I share those feelings of enthusiastic and constructive optimism. This has been a really rich conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your thinking and so openly. If people want to find out more about your work, there's climateeducate.com, I think is your main website.
Yeah.
We'll share some of those other links in the notes after this when the video's ready. Thank you so much. I'll say goodbye, turn off the recording,
Okay.
and then